So Toni Morrison wants to talk with us about sermons. She wants to look at the sermons in Paradise and in Beloved and in Jazz, and there may be a few others that she wants to look at, but I think she's going to send us a list. But today I thought we'd look at the sermons in Paradise and get started on our thinking, as Mara said. So my topic today is Ministry in Paradise. Paradise is the third novel in Toni Morrison's richly imagined trilogy about African American life from the time of slavery and Reconstruction through the post-civil rights era of the mid-1970s. Like Beloved and Jazz, the two novels which precede it, Paradise is saturated with history both spoken and unspoken, and marked by brilliant doublings and repetitions that reveal layer after layer of the histories that haunt this novel. Histories that stretch back through the stories of Jazz and Beloved all the way to Genesis and Exodus, with their stories of the loss of paradise, the journey of the people of Israel out of slavery, and the longing for a promised land. In the opening scene of Morrison's Paradise, 9 church-going men, armed with rifles, drive from their town to an isolated former convent 17 miles away and proceed to murder the women who live there. They shoot the white girl first, Morrison writes in the opening sentence of the novel. With the rest, they can take their time. These men are from Ruby, an all-black town in Oklahoma, founded by the remnant of a previous all-black town called Haven, founded in great hope by former slaves. When the town came undone during the Great Depression and the men went off to fight in the war, they cherished the idea of their town and dreamed of founding a new one. When black veterans who had fought for this country were met on their return by racial violence, the patriarchs of several Haven families, the New Fathers, who prided themselves on the racial purity evident in the deep blackness of their skin, packed up their families and the communal oven that had been a kind of sacred gathering place in Haven and moved westward, deeper and deeper into Oklahoma. There they founded a town called Ruby, 90 miles from any other town, self-sufficient and prosperous, a place, most of all, where women and children could live in safety. Morrison's novels, as several of our speakers have noted in these workshops, are full of open secrets, histories, and rules that remain unspoken, but as Morrison puts it, live a quietly throbbing life and shape everything that happens. The history of black towns in Oklahoma is one of the open secrets that Morrison brings into the light in this novel. From 1865 to 1920, African Americans created more than 50 self-governed communities in what in 1907 became the state of Oklahoma, often on the so-called unassigned land of Native Americans. There was a time when African Americans viewed Oklahoma as a kind of promised land, a paradise, because of these towns. Some of these towns, about a dozen, still exist today. An accompanying open secret to this history is the history of racial violence visited on self-sufficient, self-governing African American communities. In 1921, a white mob attacked the Greenwood district in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Greenwood was sometimes called the Black Wall Street because its inhabitants created their own capital and built a thriving community with grocery stores, 2 newspapers, 2 movie theaters, lots of churches, a few nightclubs. It was a community served by African American professionals, doctors, dentists, lawyers, ministers. When a young man from Greenwood was accused of assaulting a white woman, and a lynch mob gathered outside the jail where he was being held, men from the Greenwood district walked over, rifles in hand, to show their support for the young man. There's a similar scene you'll remember in Paradise where the men of Ruby emerge quietly but heavily armed from their homes and their businesses when some young girls are being threatened by a couple of carloads of white men who are traveling through the town. At some point, a shot was fired, and after that, a white mob attacked the Greenwood district for 16 hours, sending 800 people to the hospital and killing as many as 300. 10,000 people were left homeless, and 35 city blocks in Greenwood were destroyed by fire. For a very long time, the Greenwood Massacre was what Morrison calls in Paradise a public secret. It was not until 1996 that a full-scale investigation into the massacre began, culminating in a report in 2001. 2 years ago, in 2010, a memorial park was built in Tulsa that tells the story of the massacre. And in May of this year, the last known remaining survivor of the Greenwood District massacre died. His name was Otis Clark. Mr. Clark had been 18 years old at the time of the riot, and he lived to be 109. Hidden histories like these haunt this novel and shape the choices of the characters. The unspoken fear that the boundaries of Paradise might be violently breached leads the men of the town to breach the boundaries of the convent. God at their side, Morrison writes, the men take aim for Ruby. Morrison portrays the founding of the town of Ruby as grounded in experiences of the vulnerability of women and the anguish of the men who were unable to protect them. When the first families were on a journey from Fairleigh, Oklahoma, to what would be the town of Haven, several of the women were pregnant. When they sought shelter, they were turned away, often by light-skinned black people who rejected them because their skin was so dark. It was the shame of seeing one's pregnant wife or sister or daughter refused shelter that had rocked them, Morrison writes, and changed them for all time. The humiliation did more than rankle. It threatened to crack open their bones. These stories, passed down from father to son, become hardwired in the new town of Ruby, reenacted by the town's children each Christmas in the town's nativity play. 7 holy families are turned away from the inn by the cruel innkeeper. The children cry out, "But our wives are pregnant. Our children are going to die of thirst." And so the story is passed on from generation to generation. Stories about the vulnerability of women and girls punctuate the novel and establish a notion of Paradise itself as a place where no one within 90 miles can see the women and girls of Ruby as prey. There is the story of the girls who are threatened by the group of white men passing through Ruby in their cars. There's the story of Elder Morgan, who sees a black prostitute beaten by 2 white men in New York City. Elder tries and fails to protect her, but he sees her face and prays for her every day for the rest of his life. Steward Morgan imagines what it would be like if his own wife were denied shelter. The thought of that helplessness made him want to shoot somebody, Morrison writes. And of course, the women of the convent, the women who are ultimately shot by Steward and the other 8 men from Ruby, each bear within them stories of humiliation and violation. All of these stories point further back than the founding of Haven and Ruby. They point back to the first novel of this trilogy, to Beloved, and the sexual violence to which enslaved women were subjected. The men of Ruby cannot tolerate light-skinned black people. They make one man in the community send the light-skinned woman he loves back where she came from, a loss from which he never recovers. Not only do light-skinned people remind them of those who refused to help their mothers and fathers when they were on their journey, but also because their skin threatens to excavate an unbearable cultural memory of enslaved women who could not protect themselves nor look to the men and their families for protection from the sexual violence endemic to the system of slavery, a system Sethe kills her daughter to protect her from. When we meet the inhabitants of the town of Ruby in 1976, and if you're as old as I am, you will remember that 1976 was the bicentennial celebration of this country. I think a not insignificant choice on Morrison's part for the temporal setting of this story. When we meet the citizens of Ruby, there's no one left with a direct experience of slavery. The patriarchs and matriarchs of the town remember the ex-slaves who first founded Haven and who passed the dream of an all-black town where women and children would be safe from harm to them. But the next generation is further removed, both from the time of slavery and the founding of Haven and Ruby. The history that the new generation cares about is the more recent history of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, of the young people who endured abuse at lunch counters and in the streets in order to move history forward. Their elders are much more interested in preserving the self-sufficient home they have created in Ruby than they are in integration. Integration is not what they're seeking. A paradise free of white people, even light-skinned people, where they can take care of their own is what they want. Stuart Morgan, one of the new fathers, can't stand the idea of young people trying to integrate the lunch counters, and he writes a hateful letter to the woman who organized the drugstore protests in Oklahoma City. 10 years earlier, he had called Thurgood Marshall a stir-up Negro for his anti-segregation work in Norman, Oklahoma. The young people of Ruby, however, have a much different perspective. For them, Ruby is a prison calling itself a town, where the pressure to subsume their individuality into the larger community is tremendous. They begin to reinterpret the founding story of the town, beginning with the inscription on the oven that the founders of Ruby brought from Haven. Like a fragment of an ancient manuscript, the inscription over the oven is incomplete. It reads, ... the furrow of his brow. The patriarchs of Ruby, arguing from the eyewitness account of Miss Esther, who had seen the original oven when she was 5 years old and run her fingers over the letters, argued that the original inscription read, "Beware the furrow of his brow," a command, as they understood it, to live in the fear of the Lord, to understand that God's power is sovereign. The young people argue that the original inscription could not possibly have demanded such subservience from the former slaves who gathered around it every day to cook and share meals, to celebrate baptisms, to build up the community. The young people argued that the inscription must have read, "Be the furrow of his brow," a command not to cower before God, but to be God's instrument of justice in the world. Destry Beauchamp tells the town elders that no ex-slave who had the guts to make his own way, build a town out of nothing, could think like that. This enrages Deacon Morgan, one of the new fathers. "That's my grandfather you're talking about," he says. "Quit calling him an ex-slave like that's all he was. He was also an ex-lieutenant governor, an ex-banker, an ex-deacon, and a whole lot of other exes. And he wasn't making his own way. He was part of a whole group making their own way." The argument about the oven quickly becomes an argument about slavery. Who gets to say what this history means? The elders whose grandparents had been enslaved, or the young people searching in their past for clues to their identity and their purpose? And who are the true heirs of Ruby's founders? The conservative bankers and ministers who have sacrificed to preserve their grandparents' vision unchanged, or the young people inspired by civil rights activists to change their world. The young people grew up acting out the story of their ancestors in the annual nativity play. It is hardwired into them, just as the elders of Ruby hoped. But knowing the story in their bones turns out to be no guarantee that it will mean the same thing to them as it did to their parents. It's our history too, sir, one of the young people says, not just yours. The argument over the oven's inscription, which is at once hermeneutical, theological, ethical, and practical, makes a claim on every person in Ruby, but perhaps none more than the ministers, who address it in their pastoral care, in their prayers, in their ritual actions, and most especially in their preaching. The town is full of ministers, and we hear bits and pieces of their various sermons, but two ministers emerge from the story whose sermons Morrison allows us to experience in their entirety. Reverend Senior Pulliam and Reverend Richard Misner are at odds throughout the story, and Pulliam stands against the young people while Misner stands with them. But one of the very powerful things Morrison does in her portrayal of these two ministers is to link them together in a lyrical history of ministry that she tucks into the heart of this novel. In a long, cascading paragraph that sounds like a sermon itself, Morrison sings a hymn to ministers called to ministry in the midst of slavery, ministers who whispered words of liberation in cabins and clearings, ministers who held onto the Spirit with their teeth and their fists, ministers who, as she writes, wiped white folks' spit from the faces of children, hid strangers from posses and police, relayed life-preserving information faster than the newspaper and better than the radio. Ministers who buried the dead children of broken-hearted mothers, all the while preaching that death was life, don't you know, and every life, don't you know, was holy, don't you know, in his eyesight. If you open Paradise to the exact middle, page 159 out of 318 pages, you will find this mini history of ministers who both fought for and marveled at the survival of their people, a prose poem around which the whole novel turns. Now, the first full sermon we encounter in Paradise belongs to Reverend Pulliam. Although he is in Reverend Misner's church, he has been asked to say a few words to mark the wedding of K.D. Morgan and Arnett Fleetwood. Like many weddings, this wedding comes bearing several burdens having nothing to do with the couple. And this one in particular bears the burden of the community's expectation that it will mend the conflict between these two feuding families. And here comes Reverend Pulliam to put a little more pressure on everyone. I once heard Toni Morrison speak about the sermons in Paradise while she was in the middle of writing this book. I remember that she said it was hard, she was finding it hard not to slip into cliches or familiar phrases while writing these sermons. She wanted them to sound, as the best sermons do, like authentic human speech. She wanted her sermons to reflect words chosen with care out of a genuine desire to communicate something of eternal importance. Pulliam Sermon has all of these qualities. There are long sentences punctuated by short sentences that land like blows. Love is divine only and difficult always. If you think it is easy, you are a fool, Pulliam proclaims. You have to earn God. You have to practice God. You have to think God carefully. And the climax of this fierce wedding homily, you are human and therefore educable, and therefore capable of learning how to learn, and therefore interesting to God, who is interested only in himself, which is to say, he is interested only in love. Do you understand me? God is not interested in you. In his divinity school address, Ralph Waldo Emerson defined preaching as life passed through the fire of thought. Reverend Pulliam preaches a sermon that sounds more like thought passed through the fire of life. Is Pulliam one of those ministers who wiped spit from the faces of children? We don't learn much about his history, except that it is knit tightly into the history of Ruby. He is arguing with the young people of Ruby in this sermon, and he is arguing with Reverend Misner as well. But Morrison resists making him a caricature of a cranky old preacher. The transcendent, all-powerful, and wholly mysterious God Reverend Pulliam invokes is a God out of reach of young people arrogant enough to think they can reinterpret the oven, to be sure. But he is also a God out of reach of those who would spit on children, a God out of the reach of lynch mobs, out of the reach of the police, out of the reach of death. This God sees all and judges all. Pulliam's clipped, ferocious words communicate more than his frustration with Misner and his ways. They communicate his desire for a power greater than any earthly power, a God who would, in the end, insist upon justice, not because of the prayers or actions of any frail humans, but because justice is what God is all about. Pulliam's refusal to sugarcoat this wedding harks back to the demanding and unsentimental ministries of other Morrison characters, Baby Suggs in Beloved, Ethel Fordham in Home. Misner knew, Morrison writes, that Pulliam's words were a widening of the war he had declared on Misner's activities, tempting the young to step outside the wall, outside the town limits, shepherding them, forcing them to transgress, to think of themselves as civil warriors. Not trusting himself to speak, as angry as he is, Misner grabs the cross from the wall behind him and holds it out to the congregation, trying to make them see it. As he holds it, he preaches a sermon in his head, which he hopes he is communicating through this gesture. He wants the congregation to see the cross as both ordinary and sublime, the mark of a human figure poised to embrace. He wanted them to see Jesus as a death row felon who moved the relationship between God and man from CEO and supplicant to one-on-one. He wanted them to see that the death of this one solitary black man brought human beings into the spotlight, into the principal role in the story of their lives. Not only is God interested in you, Misner shouted inside his head to the congregation before him, he is you. When we next hear Misner preaching, he is standing at the grave of little Save Marie, one of the 4 of Sweetie Fleetwood's damaged children. These children are ghostly presences in the novel. We don't often see them, but we see the slow-burning anxiety they create in Ruby, and we see their mother breaking under the burden of their care and the hopelessness of their condition. As he preaches, Misner's mind drifts, never a good sign when you are preaching. He imagines in his daydream the future of Ruby, a future in which the young people dream of leaving and the old people are full of regret, a future in which ministers preach eloquent sermons which fewer and fewer people hear and apply to their everyday lives. And when Morrison does bring us back into the words of his sermon, we see that his words are indeed eloquent and yet somehow detached from what is really happening. The thoughts of the mourners at the grave begin to turn to other matters, what they'll cook for Thanksgiving dinner, what they think of their neighbors. But just as he draws the sermon to an end, Misner finds his voice and begins to shout, "Wait, wait." And we hear him begin to preach a sermon that blends Pulliam's fierce questioning of the human tendency to make everything about ourselves and Misner's own love of the way human beings manifest their existence on this earth. Do you think, he asks, that this was a short, pitiful life bereft of worth because it did not parallel your own? Let me tell you something. The love she received was wide and deep, and the care given to her was gentle and unrelenting, and that love and care enveloped her so completely that the dreams, the visions she had, the journeys she took, made her life as compelling, as rich, as valuable as any of ours, and probably more blessed. The funeral of Save Marie suddenly expands to include the women of the convent, murdered by the men of this community, in part because their lives did not parallel their own or fulfill their visions of what a woman ought to be. The convent women chose themselves for company, one character reflects. They don't need men and they don't need God, the men of Ruby tell each other as they load up their guns into their trucks to justify the violence they are about to inflict. There can be no graveside service for the murdered women because their bodies disappeared mysteriously just after they were shot. Indeed, the dead women seem to have taken off together in Mavis's Cadillac. Morrison's sermon opens a space to remember and honor those lives, lives that were so different from the lives of the citizens of Ruby, lives that offered unrelenting but often hidden love and care, lives as valuable as anyone's in Ruby, and maybe more blessed. Misner's funeral sermon is a critique of the very idea of paradise upon which Ruby was founded. How exquisitely human was the wish for permanent happiness, he thinks, and how thin human imagination became trying to achieve it. It's that thinning out of the imagination that he resists in his sermon for Save Marie. If we can't imagine what the lives of others are like, if we can't feel reverence for the worlds they contain within them, if all we can do is project our own fears and desires onto them, we become dangerous to them. To lack imagination is to lack mercy. What Misner describes to himself as this hard-won heaven, defined only by the absence of the unsaved, the unworthy, and the strange, has thinned out its imagination through the policing of its boundaries. The boundaries themselves soon become dangerous because what the patriarchs of Ruby try so hard to keep out, whiteness, violence, ends up getting trapped inside somehow. The convent, on the other hand, seems boundaryless and marked by constant change. The house began its life as the pleasure palace of a rich embezzler, then transformed into a convent of nuns and a school for Native American girls who had been removed from their own culture and set down in a new, unfamiliar one. Presided over by Connie, who stands alongside Pulliam and Misner as one of the ministers of this story, it becomes a sanctuary for women with no place else to go. The convent itself is a paradise, but only because its boundaries are fluid enough to make room for strangers, including people from Ruby, when they turn up. The patriarchs of Ruby want to make a paradise that cannot be breached, and who can blame them? Connie knew, however, that unbreachable boundaries erode the most essential qualities of paradise, that the solace we seek in paradise requires mercy, and mercy requires vulnerability to what is other than ourselves. Misner ends his sermon by addressing little Save Marie directly. "Oh, Save Marie," he says, "your name always sounded like save me, save me. Any other messages hiding in your name? I know one that shines out for all to see. There was never a time when you were not saved, Marie." This child, greatly loved but largely unknown, used by the town as a blank slate onto which they could project their anxieties about the future, turns out not to be a blank slate at all, but a text full of hidden messages that the town needs to hear, and a mirror of the otherness the town has tried to destroy. At least one mourner does respond to Misner's sermon by remembering the women of the convent, Billy Delia, for whom Save Marie's funeral recalls for her the kindnesses they showed her when she turned up at the convent doorstep with her face bruised and swollen. Not only does she remember and miss them, she looks for their second coming. When will they return, she wonders? When will they reappear with blazing eyes, war paint, and huge hands to rip up and stomp down this prison calling itself a town? She hoped with all her heart that the women were out there, darkly burnished, biding their time, brass medaling their nails, filing their incisors, but out there. The convent women are indeed out there, and we meet them one more time at the very end of the novel. One by one, they appear to those they had left behind at home, fathers, mothers, children. They do not appear ghostly. They eat, they swim, they bleed, but they are not wholly substantial either. They seem to need to keep moving and slip from the presence of those to whom they appear almost imperceptibly. They slip out of our grasp too, especially if we are still looking for the white girl among them. They shoot the white girl first, the novel begins. Who is that white girl the men of Ruby see when they enter the convent? I don't know. I think Morrison sends us on a wild goose chase in order to expose the racialized quality of our thinking, the ways in which we invest eyes, hair, speech, clothes, body with racialized meanings. In Playing in the Dark, Morrison writes, I am a black writer struggling with and through a language that can powerfully evoke and enforce hidden signs of racial superiority, cultural hegemony, and dismissive othering of people and language. In Paradise, she forces us to confront these same hidden signs at work not only in our language, but in our imaginations. Reading this novel is a spiritual discipline in that way, a practice that keeps revealing more and more. Paradise is Morrison's own sermon, as fierce and uncompromising as Reverend Pulliam's, and as committed to Reverend Misner's, to opening space to encounter together the open secrets of our shared history. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I am, yes. And there, you know, her mini sermon on ministry itself is on page 159, and then Pulliam's sermon is at the beginning of the chapter called Divine, and that's also where Misner's silent sermon is. And then the Save Marie sermon is in the Save Marie chapter toward the end. So if we want to look at the sermons two together, that'd be great. But please, any questions or comments, responses? Alana.
Oh, let me get the... This was a real treat. And given that sermons is the principal theme and question,
Yeah.
I was wondering where would you position her vis-a-vis the very long tradition of sermons in American culture?
Yeah.
I mean, it's,
Yeah.
you know, you open any Norton Anthology of American Literature and you're going to find a few sermons there
Yes,
as a sort of very basis of American
Yeah.
culture. And
Yeah.
so how does the African American community fit in the
Yeah.
picture? And
Yeah.
and how would you define Morrison's understanding of the sermon vis-a-vis its role within American
Yeah.
culture altogether?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things she's doing with these two ministers and these two sermons is both tying them together in a tradition, in that long paragraph, as different as they are and as opposed to each other as they are, she sees them within that tradition of African American ministry in the U.S. from the time of slavery forward. But at the same time, I think as she does in all her novels and in all her, recreations in literary form of Black life in America, just that it's not one thing. And that these two sermons are they're theologically very different, and they're coming out of, Pulliam is a Methodist, and when Anna Flood hears him preach this fierce sermon at the beginning of this wedding, she thinks, oh, he is bringing his long and large Methodist education down on Misner like a rock. What really strikes me about these sermons is how much they sound like speech that we hear in all of Morrison's novels. I mean, they sound distinctively like sermons of these two ministers, but they also sound a lot like her, both of them. And that's there's a thread running through them of, I think, what she understands authentic human speech to be. And I guess if I were to, I cited Emerson, and I've been reading Emerson because we were reading him in another class, but I do, he said, preaching is the speech of man to men. It is, it's one of the most unique and it's the most flexible of human forms, he said, of literary forms. And I think you can see her taking pleasure in that, in the flexibility of the form. Definitely grounding it in the long tradition of African American ministry and preaching. But really showing two very different, both of these men they're opposed in relation to the civil rights movement, and they're opposed in relation to the generational conflict in the town, but they're right together on desiring, the flourishing of their people and the people that they serve. And they come at it from such different theological positions. And I think it would be easy to read Pulliam as a crank, who encourages the men to go out and take care of those women at the convent, kind of stirs up some of the violence. But he also, I think, is trying to, he's trying to speak a God who is powerful enough to contain all of this and to demand justice in the end, and to make sure that happens. And I think that there are two sort of different images of God come out of the same desire. Yeah. Thank you.
Stephanie, would you talk just a little bit about comparing the role of ministers in this novel as opposed to the role of ministers in Toni's other works? For instance, in Home, when we see them we were treated to the idea that they were doing a reverse Underground Railroad. In that novel.
That's great. Charles Long, if you were here last week and heard Charles Long speaking about her novel Home, what he says is that Frank Money is following a Underground Railroad in reverse that's running from north to south, and that it's ministers along the way who are helping them. And those ministers, some of them are very generous and welcoming, and some of them are really sneering and mean. And so again, ministry doesn't mean one thing. African American ministry doesn't mean one thing. She's so intent on showing the uniqueness and diversity of all of these forms. These sermons sound to me more like the sermons of women who are not ordained by any denomination or institution, but by the communities that authorize them to lead them, like Baby Suggs. And Ethel Foreman in Home, which is I've read more recently and is more on the top of my mind. But when she's schooling see about her healing, she speaks in a similar kind of voice, especially to Pulliam, to Reverend Pulliam. You know, do you think this is news to anybody? God, you know, God's not interested in, you know, but God desires your healing, but this is not all about you in particular. I mean, she's very fierce and uncompromising and practical in the way that Pulliam is. And I think that's what I mean when I say they sound like themselves, but they also sound to me like Toni Morrison. Yeah. I'm going to be really interested to hear if she has any. I don't know if she's going to speak to us at all, but I hope that we hear a little bit more from her about the ministers. I do think this question about how to write a good sermon has been a real question for her for a long time. I think she's interested in the form, and you know, those of you who are preachers know that there's no human form of speech quite like it, and there is some freedom in it that you don't find in other forms of human speech. And I think that interests her a great deal. It seems to. Yes, please, Nancy.
I'm struck by how preaching has always been in both of these categories and in that tension. Jesus experienced that himself, preaching over against the temple preaching. We don't have in the Gospels records of the temple sermons, but we have his reactions and the reactions of parishioners in the synagogue to his interpretation, and to other scholars of the scriptures, to his interpretations, and that here, the first European settlers, the Puritans who came here, there were two preachers, and Hooker, who with his group founded Cambridge, left after 3 years because he and Cotton could not agree on the method of preaching and also on what constituted conversion. Hooker said it couldn't happen in a thunderclap. It took time. And he set something like 6 or 8 months as the minimum time it took to be awakened. And Cotton wanted the thunderclap. And Hooker emphasized using simple language and everyday images. And Cotton wanted high-flown theology. So this has always been here, and just this week after the election, there are voices decrying that we have lost traditional America in the election of Obama. And then, of course, there are plenty of other voices. And what worries me is that it's, for the moment, too much of one voice for the church in the media and the culture, not enough of the other voice, the Misner voice, because why? We are fractured and divided because we are trying to make little individual kingdoms, because we are too invested in our denominations, because our schools are not teaching us to proclaim in this world now what needs to be heard, and to find ways to do that powerfully.
Yeah, I mean, in this novel, that definitely. I'm not sure I would put Pulliam fully. I'm not sure I would categorize them as starkly as that, but it's certainly a generational conflict in this novel, which what you're talking about in our country is also in part a generational conflict.
And it's not about some wisdom.
Right. Yes, please. Sorry. Yes.
Hi,
Marilyn.
Professor Paulsell. Thank you for that really wonderful talk. After listening to Dr. Long last week, I did reread Home, and and I was struck by Ethel Fordham's talk, and also it just occurred to me that she really prepared C to hear her, and and all that fierceness of the women. First they were fierce with her, and the fierceness of the son treatment, and then she sits her on the porch with biscuits and jam, and the first time she's had sugar, and through the whole time she's been there. And then, Toni Morrison talks about her demanding love, and then she starts by saying, "I knew you before you could walk," and C is that's the thing that healed her the most, was this talk they had, and but I think it's a combination, of the, I don't know whether you call that a sermon, but it was like all that came before, the hard, tough love or whatever it was that they were telling her, about her mistakes she made, her attitude towards herself, and then these beautiful, beautiful words that Toni Morrison tells her, look inside for that free person inside of you.
Right.
Don't let anybody decide who you are.
Right.
And
Yeah, that's a great passage.
it's just so beautiful.
Yeah.
And that's slavery, someone deciding who you are, and then
Right.
you look inside and there's that free person.
Right.
And find her, locate her, and that word locate, locus. The free person is in a place,
Yeah.
where's
Right.
that place?
Right.
And C thinks, what do I love? Later she thinks, what do I love?
Right.
And then she puts her finger in the jam and
Mhm.
licks it,
Yeah.
So it's I don't know, I'll never preach a sermon, but I do, work with women who have been very
Yeah.
badly traumatized, and try to help them, and and I do think that it's just the sweetness,
Yeah.
too, right?
Well,
Yeah.
your point about Ethel Fordham preparing C to hear her, I think, is really important. And I think maybe what Morrison is saying about the mistake Pulliam is making is he just wants to, tell it, and he wants people to do what he says. Misner wants his Misner is, he wants his preaching to come out of his shared work with the young people on behalf of civil rights, and that, that these sermons are coming up out of that work. He doesn't just want to, analyze the situation and just say what he thinks it means. So that's a really important point. And, there were so many things I wanted to say about Charles Long's talk last week, because Paradise really, a lot of his points are really exemplified in this book. One of which I didn't have a way to work it in, but what he said about men going to war because it would be better than staying at home. And there's, one family loses 2 sons in Vietnam in this book, and the mother thinks, I thought war would be safer than any town outside of Ruby in Oklahoma. I thought it would be safer than Chicago. I thought it would be safer than Detroit. I thought it would, this whole litany of towns and years, and, just the incredible racialized violence going on in all of these places. So that also came up in this book as well. Carolyn Medine, who was here last week, said, I think Toni Morrison wrote that great trilogy, Beloved, Jazz, Paradise, and now she seems to be rewriting it, or maybe undoing it, deconstructing it. She's writing, A Mercy, Home, which feel like almost retellings in more schematic form and more snapshot form, or like putting part of it under a microscope or something. And I don't know if anybody, we didn't really get, it was right at the end and we didn't really get to talk about it, but that question has really stayed with me this week. Like where, these books are so epic and so richly detailed, and those are so spare. I don't know if anybody had any more thoughts about that. She thought maybe she was, kind of unraveling these stories in some way. Something we could pose to her when we see her. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Oh, it's not in response to what you just raised, because I don't think I have. But my question has to do with, I just finished rereading Baby Suggs' sermon, and what struck me, and also the sermons that you referred to in Paradise, is it seems like Toni Morrison has this real desire to not just through her sermons, but just through her entire books, to really protect the black body and to use her books. Like, when I finished reading Beloved, I felt like it was a tool of empowerment, her book itself, not just what it was about. And yeah, I mean, it's not really a question. I just wanted to make an observation.
I think that's huge. And, you know, the Baby Suggs' sermon, certainly all those passages you were referring to, Marilyn, Ethel Fordham, are all about protecting, caring for, healing the black body. I think that's absolutely right. I'm trying to think in terms of Pulliam and Misner. They're, you know, both of them are, they're working things out in their thought in a way that Baby Suggs and Ethel Fordham are bringing it more down to the level of the body, I think. And the body is more of a text for those women than it is for the male preachers, just off the top of my head. But I think that's a really important point. Jay, you look like you want to say something.
Yeah, I don't have it fully developed.
That's all right.
Capture your thoughts, Jay.
I mean, I'm wrestling with this, especially in light of some of the previous questions. You know, the connection between trauma and then retelling, you know, this theme of rememory and retelling the story, especially if, you know, if Morrison is working on, if in a Mercy and Home, retelling of the story that she's retelling, and you know, and then like the risk in preaching, particularly that comes out of, you know, African American tradition, of telling the story of trauma, you know, the Christ event, and then ending with a celebration. But there's almost like a way of, you know, you become desensitized to the story. And I guess I'm wrestling with, you know, how Morrison is inviting us to retell the story without becoming desensitized to it.
Yeah.
You know, by constantly returning to the traumatic event, the way we protect against it, you know, is to just kind of shut ourselves off.
Right.
How do we get to that place where we recognize the pain, but then, you know, like the Baby Suggs sermon, the invitation is to dance. So this mixture between like the tragicomic, the tragic and the comic that leads us beyond just being stuck in retelling a story that we never heard at all.
That's right. That's right. And that's Connie's solution too. She you know, clears out the space in the basement of the convent, and she invites these women to dance and to trace their bodies, and they do all this amazing stuff that lets them let go of their stories somehow. And the story of the founding of Haven and Ruby, that story is getting passed down. I thought about this a lot too, especially in relation to Beloveds. This is not a story to pass on, and you know, the story is getting passed on, but it's also getting reinterpreted in a way that the elders don't like. They want the passing on of the story to be the passing on not just of the narrative, but of the meaning of the narrative. And of course, there's no guarantee once you tell your story that anybody's going to think it means what you think it means. And so there's that, you know, I mean, that vulnerability, I think, is really easy to understand. You know, this story means so much to them, and they've sacrificed everything for this story to build this town. And there's something, though, about the way it's cycling through that's not getting to that point that you're talking about, that Baby Suggs helps people get to when she frees them to dance, or that Connie helps these women to get to. They get to it, and then they're killed. So that's a really, I mean, I think that's just a question that persists through every single one of her books. And if she's enacting it now, as you suggested, in her own unraveling of her stories in these shorter, more schematic books, it's really interesting. It's really interesting. I mean, you know, I think we'll be trying to comprehend her project for a very long time. It's huge and it's complex. And even just this story has so many stories in it. This story is so packed with stories, and you know, everything she does with time is so interesting, and you know, you have to really pay attention to kind of know where you are in time in this book, because she's moving around so much, back and past and future and the present. But I don't have a good answer for it, but I do think it's a central question of her whole body of work, is what are the stories to pass down, and how do we pass them down in a way that allows us to move forward? Because Ruby is stuck. They've done this great thing, but they're stuck, and then they make a terrible mistake, which Lone Dupre she's a midwife in the town. She delivered all those damaged babies and feels shunned because of it. But she feels like God gave Ruby a second chance by letting those bodies disappear, because we did kill a white girl, so the law would be out here, as one of the characters puts it. But that having them mysteriously disappear gives Ruby a second chance to get it right. And at when Misner is he's preaching his sermon, kind of thinking thoughts in his head, at the end and at the funeral, as he's thinking thoughts which are not, they're kind of depressing. It's like, oh, the kids are going to yearn to go away, and the old people are going to be sad and feel rejected, and the people aren't really going to listen to the sermons anymore. It suddenly comes to him that he wants to stay. And what she says about it is, or what he thinks about it, let's see if I can find it. Yeah, suddenly Richard Misner knew he would stay because there was no better battle to fight, no better place to be than among these outrageously beautiful, flawed, and proud people. There's something about this story that, as stuck as this community has gotten, he wants to be a part of it, and he wants to help them. He says, the future panted at the gate, right? That roads are going to come through here, and white men are going to come in their cars and drink 3-2 beer, and I want to be here to help them prepare for that and move into it in a way that's liberating and not stifling, and that gives the young people a chance to become who they are. Thank you. I'm sorry, that's not a very good answer, but I do think that's the question. Yeah, Maggie.
I was just thinking about that if maybe you had some thoughts about reading sermons versus the oral tradition, and that I think about the oral tradition of African American history, what Harvey Cox had to say about jazz and sound, and then sermons, often the difference between a text and actually what's said from the pulpit. Any thoughts about how to think about that? Yeah,
it's a really good question. I mean, these sermons are pretty literary sounding sermons, actually. They're in a novel, and so you have to read them. The place where you can kind of hear the cadences, you can hear, certainly in Pulliam's sermon, it's so brilliantly written. You'll have a sentence that's an entire paragraph, and then boom, a short little sentence. And it's just masterful the way she does it. But where you really hear the kind of the rhythms of oral preaching is in that little hymn to ministry that she tucks in the middle of the book. That death is life, don't you know, and every life, don't you know, is precious, don't you know, in God's sight. She puts the repetitions in there, and you can hear it, and she puts some words in italics, so you know which ones to emphasize. But Pulliam and Misner's sermons are definitely sermons. They're sermons to be read, because we have to read them because they're in this novel. But they're musical. That last line that Misner preaches of, that there was never a time when you were not saved, Marie. Marie rhymes with some word in the previous phrase. It's a poem. It's a beautiful, beautiful poem. But really, it's in the fragments of sermons. There's another minister in town. I'm not going to be able to remember his name, but he kind of obliquely, but humorously preaches about the women in the convent from his pulpit, and you can hear the call and response. You don't hear the call and response in Pulliam's, I think, because he doesn't want any response. He just wants to say what he has to say. But there's a little bit of a sermon somewhere in this book, in this rich and packed book, of another preacher who's neither Pulliam nor Misner, who's talking obliquely about the women, and and you can hear the call and response back and forth. And that, Alana, in response, back to your question about the tradition of African American preaching, that's certainly an important part of that tradition that we don't hear in these longer sermons. Tim, a preacher.
I'm curious about a question I have is sort of, I'm not meaning to make a broad sweep of what preaching is, but this idea of inspiration, this idea that you are channeling a voice or voices, and then going to speak, and then viewing Toni Morrison as author, giving voice to a preacher who should be channeling a voice, presumably of God or a theological voice, and wondering how Toni Morrison views perhaps the sermon, wondering what Toni Morrison's view of the novel is in relation to the aims of the sermon, what her view of readership is in relation. So sermons are weird because it's not weird because there's a guy or a woman getting up there preaching about God. It's weird because the audience has to take a certain stance too. You know, it's as if it's speaking to you. So wondering about the readership, how does she view the readership in relation to reading her novel? The sort of the ethics involved in, with the trauma stories, channeling different voices at this particular moment of address, and what that has to do with her view of the novel.
I don't know. What do you think? Yeah, what do you think? Do you think her novels are sermons?
I think that they have they're aimed at a specific effect or effects. Right. One of protection of bodies, one of responsibility of the embodied, one of opening up voices. I think her novels do have that sermonic quality, maybe not of how it sounds, but just the very ethics of listening to voices and then speaking while still listening to different voices. I just found it interesting, just, you know, as someone who preaches, seeing sermons, and these sermons are so much better than anything I'll get up there. You know what I mean? That's the other thing, where you're like, you know, it's like watching.
Do you have to be good at everything?
Yeah, reading Toni Morrison's. It was like watching the movie Doubt, hearing those sermons. You're like, oh, good, give me a break. I'm not, you know. But just this, but the sense that with a sermon, there's a certain language with its work clothes on.
Yeah, right.
You know, and the novels, you can't leave the novel the same way.
That's right.
You know, after you put it down, if you still act the same way, think the same way, you just wasted the novel.
Right.
And there's that sermonic quality, I guess, to it.
Absolutely. And, you know, you should write all that down. That was really good. She's asking something of us, right? With every novel. We are in that position, that congregational position. And is the person here who talked about Lectio Divina when Harvey Cox spoke about jazz? Do you remember that? You were there. You know, her novels are hard. They're hard. They're pure pleasure too, but she moves around in time. She, you know, says they shoot the white girl first, and then you can't figure out who the white girl is. You know, she puts some, and in this book, I think she put that particular mystery in the book for a reason, I think, and it was to evoke a certain kind of reading practice that would then expose the racialized stuff that we do in our heads. And there are a lot of moves in that, and it's amazing that she evokes that just through putting pen to paper. You know, it's really just amazing. But I do think she's asking things of us, and one of the things she's asking is a certain quality of attention, that you can't just sit and daydream over these books, that you have to really pay attention, because otherwise you won't know who's speaking, you won't know what year you're in, you won't know where you are. You have to really read, you have to just bring everything you've got to reading her. And listening to sermons is very like that, you know. I mean, that's a quality that I think, you know, that listening, being able to sit and listen to somebody speak for, I mean, if you're not in school listening to people all the time speak at you, if you just do that once a week for 20 or 30 minutes in church, it's, you know, ministers have to be able, and she does this too as a writer, I mean, ministers have to be able to leave enough doors and windows open in a sermon so that, you know, when you're about to say the main point you want to make and the mom leans down to give her child a Cheerio and misses it, there has to be another door to walk through. There has to be another way to hear that again. And in this book, I mean, I'm sure this has been done, but some brilliant person should write about all the doublings, both within these three books in the trilogy, and also in the overlapping, the way they overlap and the doublings that she, but she tells you one story and then she peels off several more layers and another character comes in and reminds you of this other character. I mean, she has twins in this book. She has all kinds of ways of doubling, save Marie and the women at the convent. She just has so many, she's doing so many literary experiments that are not just literary, but they're spiritual somehow as well, and maybe even theological as well, precisely because of what you said, because they ask particular things of us as readers. Anybody else? Yeah, Nancy, let me just see if there's anybody else who hasn't spoken yet. Yes, please. And then I'll come back to you, Nancy. Oh, no, we got to put you on tape.
I'm interested that the people giving speaking sermons in this book seem to be all male. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, since Connie seems to play that kind of a role, I haven't read the book in 20 years. Yeah. Is there anything she says that we could look at that would be sermon-like?
Yeah, I think, she has a chapter dedicated to her called Consolata, and, there's a lot in there, but the part where she gathers those women to dance, like Baby Suggs does in Beloved, I think it would be really interesting to compare those. That's one of the doublings across the books. That would be really interesting to look at. She's pretty quiet, though. She is an incredible listener. And, when a new woman, young girl, shows up at the convent, she's brought into Connie's presence, and all Connie says is, "Poor baby, sweet baby, poor baby," and yet just that alone evokes the story, begins the healing. It's a really kind of quiet interior form of pastoral care that she offers. But I think before we meet with Toni Morrison, it would be good to look at those passages side by side and to ask the question that you're asking: does Connie have a sermon? Connie has a lot going on inside her, as all these characters do, inside her mind. I mean, and even Misner tries to preach an entire sermon just in his head while holding this cross out, hoping that somehow it's communicating. But I think that would be a really important question to ask. Nancy.
I think one key difference, and no writer that I can think of could overcome it, is that we read here in our minds these sermons knowing intimately all the people who are listening and what they've been going through and what they're up to,
right.
And the sermon is speaking to that. But those of us who preach regularly stand up there not knowing that
Absolutely.
much about what's
Right.
going on,
Right.
and not knowing the critically important things that have been happening, especially the ugly things in the lives of the people sitting there, maybe one or two. And so we're in a very different position as preachers from those preaching in novels, and I don't just mean Toni Morrison's novels.
I wonder how different it is. I mean, this goes back to your question too, Tim. I mean, a sermon is something we do together, right? I mean, it's something you do with your community, and it does have to do with some things you know about that are going on and some things you don't. But if anybody in here who's preached, I know, has had this experience of you preach your sermon, you go to the back of the church, you shake hands with people, and somebody comes and says, "I really appreciated that sermon on X," or "I really appreciated that sermon on Y," and you think, "I had no idea I was preaching a sermon on that topic." And that, that's what happens. People hear what you're saying in relation to everything they're bringing. And I think it's the same when we read. She's directing us, and she's using all of her arts, the art of arts, to help us hear the way she wants us to hear and to get us to do the work that she wants us to do. But we're also making this book with her. And it matters where we're located. It matters, you know, what we've read before. It matters, a lot of stuff matters, the stories that we're bringing. I think there may be more similar than we at first think. Thanks, Mara. Thanks, everybody.
So, well, thanks for